there can be also a tie-in to sympathetic and parasympathetic. More contractionary often requires more energy from cortisol and stress hormones to fuel that pursuit, whereas something that's expansionary, even if it requires energy and effort, often can be accompanied by greater levels of parasympathetic activity. It's possible to stay more relaxed even when putting out effort, right? It's a balancing act.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow.
Hello, NeuFit Nation. Welcome to the Undercurrent Podcast. This is the last episode of 2024, and I'm going to come on solo to share with you some of my biggest learnings, insights, and reflections from this past year. And when I look back at 2024, there's a few themes that emerge, and I feel really compelled to come on and talk with you about those today. So the first one is, of course, we're always looking through the lens of the nervous system and neuroscience, right? So one theme that really jumped out at me this year was this notion of being able to use my nervous system, my own internal sense and sensations as an internal compass, specifically around alignment and a few other points that I'll get into. But that was a profound learning from this year. And then on a related topic, also the connection between psychology and biomechanics or movement science that we talk about. We talk a lot about how the nervous system limits movements, right? There's the excess tension that happens in response to injury and trauma, inhibition, the hypersensitivity that leads to pain. We talk about these protective patterns neurologically in the context of movement and recovery from injury and athletic performance. And there's also analogous principles in psychology about how we have compensatory behaviors and thought patterns. So bringing these concepts to life and really experiencing these this year was a big learning for me, and one that I definitely want to talk about. And then also, again, on a related topic, the lived experience of meditation and spiritual practice that I had this year, where there's a lot of things that I knew intellectually that I experienced this year in a way that really helped them resonate, helped them land with me in some new ways that I'm excited to share. And I also, along the way, will share some of my most influential books of this year. I definitely, care a lot about learning and tracking the books that I read and, accumulating knowledge and understanding in not just for the sake of knowing it intellectually, but in order to apply it. And that was one of the really big things for me this year, looking back, was translating these concepts that I knew intellectually into daily life and lived experience. So I'll weave in some of the books there as we go. So taking it from the top here, this first theme that I mentioned about using my nervous system as an internal compass and having a sense of alignment, really. So for context here, in terms of the word alignment, it's important. There is actually a lining up. There is a sense of direction, a sense of moving in an appropriate direction. If you're with one or more other people, a sense of moving in the same direction, right? If you're aligned. And then there's also one other piece of context that I want to touch on, and that is the notion of expansion and contraction. And I had a great conversation with my friend Wesley Kress, who has been on this podcast before, and he's on Instagram as Breakthrough Performance and Rehab. So I highly recommend, following him, checking him out. So he is a acupuncturist, doctor of Chinese medicine, and he and I had some really good conversations about this notion of yin and yang, and he helped me understand this concept in some new ways. Of course, there's the masculine and feminine, and that makes sense to me. And then he also described this notion of expansion and contraction, and how in life there's both, right? There's birth and death. There's times to, spend energy, times to replenish energy, right? So there's all these things. And this particular notion of expansion and contraction is more of an energetic one. I could be, for example, in a big house, which one might think is expansionary because of the physical size, but it actually could feel pressure if I'm having to have the burden of feeling like it's difficult to make my mortgage payment every month, or all these pressures that may come with that. Whereas a smaller apartment might be physically smaller, but might feel more expansionary energetically, because it gives the person living there a greater sense of freedom and energy. And so there can be also a tie-in to sympathetic and parasympathetic. More contractionary often requires more energy from cortisol and stress hormones to fuel that pursuit, whereas something that's expansionary, even if it requires energy and effort, often can be accompanied by greater levels of parasympathetic activity. It's possible to stay more relaxed even when putting out effort, right? It's a balancing act. And so this was really, this concept made a lot of sense to me. And then, experientially going through this year, I was able to use it as an internal compass, use this concept, this feeling, this internal neurological perception, sensation, use this to make some really tough decisions, which I'll talk about here. And I haven't actually yet talked publicly about this, but this year, my wife and I mutually decided to separate after 14 years together. We have 2 children together. There was a lot of good things in our relationship, but in the last couple of years, it became apparent that the alignment wasn't there anymore. And so it was a really difficult decision. And it, for me, became more clear and easier to make the decision. Not easy, but easier to get there when I actually slowed down and dropped in and felt my own internal sensation, my internal sense of self, and this sense of expansion and contraction, and understanding that the effort to kind of make things work in that relationship, even when it wasn't aligned, was very contractionary. Whereas the feeling of separating, as scary as it was, actually felt more expansionary and gave energy giving rather than energy draining. And I just also want to say, this is nothing negative about Brianna. She's a wonderful person. And, just because 2 people don't align in a marriage or a relationship doesn't mean that it's either one's fault, or, nothing negative about her. I, still love her. I intend to maintain a friendship and have a good co-parenting relationship, right? And all those things. So it's nothing negative about her. And thankfully there was nothing super negative, where no one had any, substance abuse problems or any abuse or cheating, or, so thankfully, nothing like that, right? But it's just this sense of alignment, and really dropping in to check in on myself. That's what gave me really the clarity and courage to be able to make a tough decision. And there was certainly, grief and sadness that came along with that. And I'll talk about that under one of the other themes. But in terms of this notion of using our nervous systems as our own internal compass, it also led me to end another relationship on the business side with a physical therapist who also has been and is a friend and is a great clinician. And so, nothing negative about him, but again, it's that sense of alignment in terms of the direction the business is going, the internal culture, priorities, things like that. And that was also very difficult, but I used that same, I kind of established this hypothesis of, okay, I'm going to drop in, see how it feels to really envision continuing on working together, see how it feels continuing on, separating from that relationship and going in a different direction, and seeing if my nervous system will tell me which one feels more expansionary, more energy giving, more life giving. And in that situation, it was also clear that ending that relationship it clearly felt better. That internal compass told me that yes, this is what had to be done. And it's been very validating in the several months since making that decision to see the positive things that have happened, the new people that have stepped up into leadership roles, different things they've been able to do, the feeling of the culture and the energy there. And just one thing in my experience, for those of you who run a business and lead a team, the biggest priority for you is engagement and alignment of your team. You can no longer, if you own a business and you have a team, you can no longer do everything yourself. You are dependent on the people who work with you. And the more engaged and aligned they are, the better they're going to be at not only doing the things that they're doing regularly, but also, solving problems and dealing with challenges that inevitably will come up. So a little aside there.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you're interested in learning more about how NeuFit and the Newbie can impact your life, please visit our website at www.new.fit, that's neu.fit, so you can learn more about how it might integrate into your professional practice, how you can use it as a patient, and you can also connect with our team there.
But it's been very cool to see how some good things have happened that validate that decision and helps sort of reinforce for me that hypothesis that using my nervous system as an internal decision-making compass has been productive, has been good. It also led me, I didn't just end relationships this year. I actually started a couple new ones on the business side, talking about hiring some new people. And I also had a big decision where for the first time in my career, I hired a bona fide, legitimate number two. And this was something that I had to work through because I had a little bit of ego around this, if I'm being totally honest, a little bit of ego around being the guy, the one with the C-level title as the CEO, the one with sort of the ultimate decision-making authority. And to give up some of that is actually challenging. And I had read this book, Traction, which describes EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System. I highly recommend it to those of you business owners out there. And they talk about this notion of having a visionary and an integrator, and how founders like myself often have to give up elements of the business that they're either not as good at performing, or that they simply can't perform as effectively because they don't have the time or bandwidth to do it. And so I knew intellectually that this was something I had to do, but it still is sort of hard to give up some of the things that I've been doing, some of my sense of identity and perception of my own status within the business or otherwise. So there was a little bit of fear there, but there was also, when I checked in and used my nervous system as this internal compass, there was also a sense that, I'd gotten to know this guy over the prior 12 months. He had been with us in a consulting role, and I got to trust him. And it's sort of, the contrast was interesting because we had worked with a couple other people whom we had kind of considered for that role, and it wasn't a good fit for a variety of reasons. And seeing the contrast where this was a good fit, where I came to really trust this individual, as did members of our team who had interacted with him and gotten to work with him, gotten to know him. So it was good to see. And then when I checked in with how I felt about it, rather than feeling, focusing on really the fear or having that take over, that sort of fear of giving up control, what I actually felt was a sense of expansionary, energetic relief and enthusiasm. Relief in the sense of, okay, good, I can hand off to someone some of the elements of the business that I'm either not as good at or don't have the time to pursue, or both, hand off to someone whom I trust can really take that and run with it and do a great job, and is a good cultural fit, and also can help us grow and achieve our goals. So that, in that situation, doing that same exercise of really dropping in and feeling what my body is telling me led me to make that decision to yes, deepen and pursue this relationship. So, really, really powerful experience. And it's, again, an example of one of these things where I sort of knew intellectually that this type of thing, this type of dynamic was important, was valuable. But this is perhaps the first, or at least the most clearly and powerfully, that I experienced it. And that just really lands differently, going through the lived experience rather than just the intellectual understanding. And it also brings up this notion of, what I would call the right kind of hard, and thoughts around discipline. So there's things that are hard that are worth doing because they're hard, right? Like a hard workout, a cold plunge, fasting. There's things that are yes, they're hard in the moment, and we know there's some long-term payoff, some health benefits, things like that. And you can overdo any of them, and I'm not necessarily saying more is better and always do those, but in the right amounts for you, there can be some benefits, of course. So it's really, I think, instructive to see the contrast. So I'll share again just from my own experience. So this year I had a really cool experience where back in the spring I did a DEXA scan, and I've been doing them annually every spring. And without doing anything that really felt hard or much different from the spring of 2023 to the spring of 2024, my body composition improved pretty substantially. I gained 10 pounds of muscle and lost 10 pounds of fat. So my scale weight was the same, but I had this really wonderful positive change in body composition. And it was interesting how, these habits around sleeping well, good nutrition, working out regularly, doing some strength workouts with the newbie, at least for part of it, for my upper body and lower body each week, doing a sprinting workout each week, doing a couple other things, that I like to do just week over week for 52 weeks in a row, made this great difference. And so there's this interesting thing where each of those workouts and some of those habits certainly take effort, but because there's a sense of alignment, it doesn't feel contractionary and draining. It feels more expansionary and energy giving. And there's an interesting neurological underpinning there that has to do with the balance of adrenaline and noradrenaline, which fuel effort, and dopamine, which gives us that sense of motivation. It's often perceived as reward, but it's really more about expected reward. But it's that sense that what we're doing is worth it. And that physiology, and of course, thinking about the neuroscience behind these subjective feelings is fascinating and instructive. And so being able to balance that and thinking about how we manage our dopamine is really important. And that brings up, two books that I really enjoyed and highly recommend. One is called Dopamine Nation, and the other is The Molecule of More. Both of these describe dopamine physiology in ways that, can be very instructive, can be very helpful, and that helped me understand how to really get my sense of my quote unquote dopamine hit, get my sense of reward from the process of working hard when it's going in the right direction, and also understand that the contrast where I could be working hard, working to do something like, for example, I talked about a couple of these relationships that, I ended up ending this year, where, I was working hard to make those work, but it was more contractionary and not necessarily the best use of that effort because of that lack of alignment. And so I think to think about the book Discipline is Destiny, which is another great one that I read this year from the Ryan Holiday series on Stoicism, which any of those books I would recommend. Ego is the enemy, the obstacle is the way, courage is calling, discipline is destiny, right thing right now. All really, really great books. But in Discipline is Destiny, it was really interesting because in my marriage, I had this sort of sense of, identify as a person who has discipline or is disciplined. And I thought that just sort of grinding it out in the relationship was the disciplined thing to do. And in that book, he talks about how, yes, discipline is important, as is the discipline of, I guess, what I would describe as discernment, or what he says as knowing where to apply that discipline. And, one of the chapters was about, I think it was a Roman army that actually retreated in one battle. And it seemed like that was an undisciplined move, but it actually gave them the opportunity to regroup so they could come back and win the war. And knowing where to apply discipline, that was a big lesson this year for me. And let's see, I think that was the main points on that theme. So I'll transition to this next theme, which is the parallels between psychology and biomechanics, about how, we talk about these notions of compensatory movement patterns and how compensatory behaviors and thought patterns also exist in the nervous system and are just this wonderful analogous world. And there's one book in particular that I read this year that is very relevant here, and it's called No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz, or Dick Schwartz, who is the developer of a system called internal family systems. And it's used a lot in psychology, psychoanalysis, counseling, right? That world. And it's the notion that we have a self, and that, like self with a capital S. And that self is sort of this, pure, wonderful being. But then we have parts of us that come online, sort of like you think about a schizophrenic has multiple personalities. We all have these parts, even those of us who are not schizophrenic. We have these different parts that carry burdens and that come online to protect us. And so, for example, someone might have a part that is, I'll speak for myself. I have a part that was sort of compulsively wanting to work and achieve. And it comes from my feelings of not being worthy of love and my feelings of needing to earn the love of my parents. And, that might even just be a story that I made up. It might not even be true, from them. But there's a part of me that would just want to compulsively work and achieve and be more productive, etc., because that was how I got my sense of worthiness. And so, examining that is interesting. And then, another one that came up for me, and perhaps some of you can relate to this either in yourself or people but difficulty setting boundaries, wanting to be a people pleaser, caring too much about what other people think. And some of this, likely goes back to my childhood, where I have a great mother, but there were times when, she'd get angry, as people do, and I would sort of freeze and feel like I couldn't stand up for myself. And this was at a time when, I didn't have the resources in terms of, I didn't know what to say or how to stand up for myself or how to excuse myself, or that I even could just say, all right, I'm going to leave the room. I'll come back when we can have a more calm conversation, right? There's things that I know now, but didn't know then. And so I developed these patterns, as many of us do, especially in childhood, develop these compensatory behavior patterns where we feel like we always have to put on a happy face, or, can't set boundaries, can't speak up for ourselves, right? Whatever it might be. And these, however we compensate for these feelings of not being enough or worthy, all these different things. So there's really interesting. It's really interesting for me to see these patterns of behavior. And then there's two books that really jump out. One I mentioned is the notion, the book No Bad Parts. And then another one is Waking Up by Sam Harris, about meditation, where he talks about spiritual practice as really getting back to baseline, or what Dick Schwartz would call the self, right? Getting back to baseline experience and using meditation as a tool to sort of observe and ultimately break through the noise, the mental chatter, the programming, or the parts, as Dick Schwartz would describe in No Bad Parts. And so, having read both of these books, it gave me a really interesting framework to understand some of the experiences that I was going through. And that speaks to this third theme, which is the the value or the new understanding that I gained this year of meditation. One other book I'll mention is Rewire Your Mind by Shauna Shapiro, a wonderful professor and actually a friend who I'm grateful to have gotten to know in the last year. Highly recommend her book. And what really came up for me this year was the notion of meditation, what it really means, right? So I had thought, and I had a great conversation also with Wesley Kress about this, a great conversation where we talked about how a lot of times in meditation, if we have read spiritual texts, we have a sense of the quote unquote end goal of meditation. And so we use meditation to sort of perform or practice a happy, peaceful end state, whatever we think that should be. Whereas true meditation is really more about mindfulness, which is just described so beautifully in Shauna Shapiro's book, Rewire Your Mind, in Waking Up by Sam Harris. Mindfulness is not rehearsing or practicing or performing some end state, but it's meeting the reality of what's happening right now. And right now it could be messy. It could be, I could feel anger. I could feel grief and sadness. I could feel bored. I could feel, different things that are quote unquote negative. I could feel shame. My inner critic could be speaking about self-judgment. And the key is to be with what is. And that was particularly interesting for me when I went through this process of separating from my wife. And during the few days before and the few weeks after, I went through a period where I experienced, really the most intense grief and sadness of my life. And if I'm really being candid, I cried more in that month than I had in the entire decades of my life before that cumulatively. And it doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. It just means that it was hard. There's a great saying that grief means that the love mattered, that the relationship mattered, and it did. It was, my marriage, primary, intimate romantic relationship for 14 years. And it was like mourning the death, right? Instead of the death of a person, it was the death of that relationship, the death of a family dynamic that did have a lot of wonderful parts, even if, we decided not to continue on in that direction. And it was really sad. And I can even feel it now as I'm recounting it months after. I feel some of that sadness. And it was also profound to have this experience. I'm so glad I had some of these conversations with Shauna Shapiro beforehand, and even during some of this, where she reminded me to feel the feeling, right? To practice mindfulness, to experience what's happening rather than suppress or avoid it, because then it's going to come up later in other ways and cause problems, health problems or behavioral problems or psychological problems, right? Whatever. So I got to really sit with and feel that intense, deep, heavy grief. And I had that experience that Sam Harris describes, and he talks about this distinction between consciousness and its contents. And so the contents of my consciousness were this intense grief and sadness. But I could also understand, I could feel that I also, was more the consciousness rather than the contents. I could identify that I'm able to observe this, and therefore I'm not the sadness, but I am the one who is feeling sad. And I wasn't therefore consumed by it, but I was experiencing it and letting it run its course. And that was just a profound, really beautiful, even though sad, experience. And it really brought home for me these notions of what meditation and mindfulness really is. So that was really interesting. And then also, in terms of lived experience, there's another intellectual concept that I understood, which is, my happiness should not be dependent on external circumstances. It shouldn't be dependent on, how much money I have in the bank, the house I live in, the car I drive, stuff like that, right? But even though I knew that, I was living with my family in a nice house and had aspirations of affording and being able to move into an even bigger and better house. And if I'm really reflecting, part of me thought that yes, that would increase my happiness. And then I had this whole shakeup where I moved from that house into an 1,100 square foot apartment, and I was kind of scared, kind of dreading it, thinking, gosh, I'm going to be feel claustrophobic, constricted. I'm going to be I wouldn't say miserable, I'm exaggerating, but it's gonna adversely affect my sort of day-to-day quality of life and emotional life. And it ended up being a profound realization to understand that, my life, my happiness outside of that, intense period of sadness that I described, but generally my happiness and my life is about the same in this much smaller apartment as it was in a bigger, nicer house. And that's an interesting realization to understand that this, like, the consciousness and its contents. Or also it brings up another book from this year, which is The Psychology of Money. And that was a really good book about how for a lot of people, chasing money becomes an addiction and gains control of the person. And that if we take a moment and reflect, when we're thinking about money, what we're really after is what it allows us to do, whether it's meeting basic needs and being free from some of the stress and pain and suffering of not being able to meet basic needs like food and shelter, right? So it's being able to avoid pain, and it's also being able to move toward pleasure. But the pleasure is not having more zeros in your bank account, right? The pleasure is the experiences that money allows one to have, whether it be, going on vacations, going to concerts or see shows with loved ones, whether it's the experience of being able to give money to others, and donate one's resources to help improve the quality of life of others, how rewarding and gratifying that is. Or having a house, not because you can sit there and just gloat in having a nice house, but because it allows you to have your friends and family come over, allow people to stay with you. It's a conduit for these experiences. And so, going through this experience was the first time I really viscerally felt that at the level of lived experience, that my happiness really is not dependent on the house that I'm in and things like that. So that was another profound experience. So one other thing that I want to make sure I touch on, I'm just looking through the bullet points I had prepared here. I want to make sure that I touch on the self. I mentioned this notion of the self versus parts, and the self is described by this list that I think is just beautiful and wonderful, of 8 C's, right? Words that start with C. So I'll ask you to reflect on times when you have felt these, one or more of these, because when you do, then you are identifying with and living from yourself, this baseline, good, pure, wonderful part that we all have, or self-being that we all are. And when we get away from these, that's when we're overly identifying with some of these parts or these compensatory behavior and thought patterns. So the 8 C's: compassion, curiosity, calmness, confidence, courage, clarity, creativity, connectedness. So as I wind down here today, I want to draw one more connection between what we talk about in the neuroscience of rehab and performance, and relate that back to psychology. So there's the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. And that says that we're always getting better, right? Always adapting to whatever it is that we're doing. And so we can get better at bracing, constricting, avoiding, or we can get better at dropping in, making contact with reality, observing it, feeling it, and allowing our real experiences to guide us. And that's something that I hope this discussion helps inspire you to consider how you can do more of this in your life. And we can practice and get better at being in touch with those 8 C's, right? If we feel like we're in a place where we feel full rather than empty, where we feel like we're acting out of love rather than trying to get love, if we feel like we're more from faith, where we can relax and let go, has a little bit of this element of surrendering rather than, hope and clinging sort of thing. If we feel like we're in that space, let's acknowledge that, pay attention to that, let's appreciate that, and reinforce and continue attempting to drop in and acting from that place. And then we can build that habit. We can adapt in that direction. And I think the more that we do that, ultimately, the better off we will all be. Even if we go through challenging times, even if we have to make difficult decisions, if they're aligned with who we are, if we're using our own internal sense, our nervous systems as an internal compass, if we're acting from our own truth and lived experience, I think we're all going to end up in better places, moving in positive directions. And that is my wish for all of you as we close this year. If you are listening to this at the end of 2024 when it's released, I hope you have a wonderful holiday season. And if you're listening to it later on, whatever time of year it is, I hope these lessons land with you. This was probably the most of my own personal life that I have shared on this podcast, and I do it with the sincere hope and intention that it's helpful, that you can get something out of it, whether it's the clarity and confidence to use your own internal compass, whether it's a new understanding of meditation, whether it's some concepts that if you're running a practice you can use in talking to people to help them understand compensatory patterns, or help things land and hit home for them in different ways. Whatever it might be, I hope some of this really landed with you. And I thank you for tuning in, and I will see you on the next episode of the Undercurrent podcast.